The silence in the house was heavier than the furniture. It had been 2 weeks since the funeral, and the air still smelled faintly of lilies and stale coffee. I hated lilies. Robert knew I hated lilies, but people send them anyway because they do not know what else to do with death. They send flowers that smell like a funeral parlor to a house that already feels like a tomb. My name is Martha Calloway, and for 40 years I was a forensic accountant for the state. I spent my life looking for the stories hidden inside numbers. People lie, and they smile, and they make promises, but numbers never lie. If you know how to look at them, they scream the truth. But now, I was just a widow in a large, empty house in Connecticut. I was 68 years old, and to the world, I had become invisible. I was just the poor woman who needed casseroles and sympathy cards. I sat at Robert's heavy oak desk in his study. The leather chair still held the shape of him, and I had to put a cushion behind my back to reach the keyboard. Robert had been the director of the Calloway Foundation for the last decade. It was his pride and joy. He built homes for seniors who had lost their savings. It was noble work. But Robert was a dreamer, and dreamers are often messy with details. I was trying to organize the tax documents for the estate lawyer. It was a tedious job, but it was the only thing keeping me sane. If I stopped moving, I would have to feel the grief waiting in the hallway, so I kept moving. I sorted receipts and invoices into neat little piles. Piles for the house, piles for the medical bills, piles for the foundation. That was when I saw it. It was a bank statement from 3 months ago. It should have been shredded. Robert was usually careful about shredding, but towards the end, the medication made him foggy. It was stuck between a magazine and an electric bill. I pulled it out and smoothed the wrinkles on the mahogany desk. It was a standard transfer record for the foundation. Most people would have glanced at it and seen nothing but a list of expenses, construction materials, permits, consulting fees. But I am not most people. My eyes went straight to the decimal points. There is a rhythm to legitimate business expenses, a chaotic but natural pattern. But this statement had a stutter. I adjusted my reading glasses and leaned in closer. There was a recurring payment to a company called Obsidian Solutions, $7,000.42. Then 2 days later, another payment for $7,000.12. Then another for $7,030. It was the Binford's Law anomaly. In a natural set of numbers, the leading digit is likely to be small, like a 1 or a 2. But here the numbers were too random. They were too perfect in their randomness. They looked like numbers someone had made up trying to make them look real. It was the kind of mistake a sloppy amateur makes when they are trying to hide a theft. I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck, and it had nothing to do with the drafty window. I remembered who handled the accounts now. Gavin Thorne. Gavin was Robert's protégé. He was 42 years old, with teeth that were too white and suits that cost more than my first car. He called me Auntie Martha at the funeral. He held my hand with his manicured fingers and told me not to worry my pretty little head about the finances. He said he would take care of everything. He said I should just rest and recover. I looked at the paper again. Obsidian Solutions. I had never heard Robert mention them. Not once. And Robert told me everything. We talked about the foundation every night over dinner. He told me about the zoning issues and the price of lumber. He never mentioned an Obsidian Solutions. I reached for the phone to call Gavin, but my hand stopped in mid-air. If this was a mistake, Gavin would laugh it off. He would treat me like a confused old woman. He would say, "Oh, Auntie Martha, You are looking at the wrong column, or that is just boring administrative stuff. But if it was not a mistake, then calling him would be the worst thing I could do. If I tipped my hand now, he would cover his tracks. He would shred the evidence. He would lock me out. I put the phone down. I took a deep breath, and the smell of lilies seemed to fade, replaced by the sharp metallic scent of adrenaline. I had not felt this in years. It was the feeling of the hunt. I was not just a widow anymore. I was Martha Calloway, and I had caught millionaires and mobsters with nothing more than a calculator and a keen eye. I opened the bottom drawer of the desk where Robert kept his old ledgers. I needed to see more. One piece of paper was a suspicion, but 3 pieces of paper was a pattern. I needed to go to the foundation headquarters. I needed to get into the archives. Gavin thought I was fragile. He thought I was broken by grief. He thought I was just a sweet old lady who would sit quietly and fade away. I picked up the bank statement and folded it neatly, placing it inside my pocketbook. I looked at the empty chair across the room where Robert used to sit and read the paper. I miss you, Robert, I whispered to the silence. But I am not going to let him steal your legacy. I stood up and smoothed down my skirt. I walked to the mirror in the hallway and checked my reflection. My hair was gray and pulled back in a sensible bun. My cardigan was soft and beige. I looked harmless. Perfect. I grabbed my car keys. I was going to pay Gavin a visit. The headquarters of the Calloway Foundation was a building that Robert had hated. He wanted brick and ivy and warmth, but the board voted for steel and glass. It stood in the center of the financial district like a shard of blue ice dropped into the concrete city. I parked my 10-year-old sedan between a Porsche and a sleek black Tesla. My car looked like a dusty relic from another era, and I suppose I did too. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. I pinched my cheeks to give them a little color, but not too much. I needed to look tired. I needed to look like a woman who was unraveling at the seams. I practiced a wobbly smile. It was a weapon I had not used in a long time, but I found that the muscle memory was still there. The lobby smelled of ozone and filtered air. The receptionist was a young girl with terrifyingly sharp eyebrows who looked at me as if I were a delivery driver who had lost her way. When I told her my name, her expression shifted from annoyance to a pitying sort of panic. She picked up the phone and whispered urgently. 5 minutes later, the elevator doors slid open and Gavin Thorne stepped out. He was wearing a suit that was so blue it almost vibrated. His smile was wide and practiced the kind of smile that stops at the mouth and never quite reaches the eyes. Martha, he boomed, and his voice echoed off the marble floors. He rushed forward and took my hands in his. His palms were soft and clammy. I suppressed the urge to pull away. I am so sorry to drop in like this, Gavin, I said. And I let my voice crack just a little at the end. I just didn't know where else to go. The house is so quiet. He made a sympathetic noise in his throat and guided me toward the elevator. Of course, Martha, of course. Come up to the office. We can get you some tea. You really shouldn't be driving in your condition. I did not ask him what condition he thought I had. I just nodded and let him lead me like a lost child. His office was on the top floor. It was a corner suite that used to belong to Robert. Robert had filled it with books and pictures of our dogs and messy stacks of blueprints. Gavin had stripped it bare. It was minimalist and cold. There was a single abstract painting on the wall that looked like a violent red splash. He sat me down in a low chair that was impossible to get out of gracefully while he sat behind the massive glass desk. He looked down at me from his throne. "So, Martha, what can I do for you?" he asked, clasping his hands. I assume you received the check for the funeral expenses. I did, thank you, I said. I twisted the strap of my purse nervously. I was not here for money, Gavin. I was hoping for a favor. He stiffened slightly. His eyes flicked to the clock on the wall. A favor. I took a deep breath. I miss him, Gavin. I miss him so much. And I was thinking that I would like to go through the old archives. You know, the old project files from when the foundation first started? I just want to read his old notes. I want to see his handwriting again. It would help me find closure. Gavin blinked. He had been expecting me to ask for a seat on the board or an increase in my allowance. He was not expecting a sentimental request from a grieving widow. The archives, he said slowly. Martha, those are just dusty old boxes in the basement. There is nothing down there but tax returns and receipts from the 90s. It is not very interesting. It is to me, I whispered, and I dabbed at my dry eyes with a tissue. Please, Gavin. I just want to sit down there for a few hours. I promise I won't touch anything important. I just want to feel close to him. He looked at me, and I saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was weighing the risk. He looked at my trembling hands and my sensible shoes and my gray hair. He saw a lonely old woman who wanted to cry over old paper. He did not see a forensic accountant who could spot a shell company from a mile away. He relaxed. His shoulders dropped, and that oily smile returned. Well, if it will help you heal Martha, then who am I to say no? He opened a drawer and pulled out a key card. He slid it across the glass desk. This will get you into the basement storage levels. Just do me a favor and don't make a mess. We have the auditors coming next month, and we need everything in order. I reached out and took the card. The plastic felt cool and hard against my fingertips. It felt like a key to a prison cell, or perhaps a key to the kingdom. Thank you, Gavin, I said. You are a good boy. Robert always said you were special. That part was true. Robert had said he was special, but Robert had meant it as a compliment. I meant it as a diagnosis. I stood up, and it took me a moment to struggle out of the low chair. Gavin did not offer to help. He was already looking at his phone, typing a message to someone else. He had dismissed me. I was handled. I was pacified. I walked out of the office and toward the elevators. I kept my head down and my steps slow until the doors closed and I was alone in the steel box. Then I straightened my spine. The wobbly smile vanished. I looked at the keycard in my hand. Access granted. I pressed the button for the basement. The elevator began to descend, and I felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. Gavin thought he had sent me to a playroom to keep me occupied. He had no idea he had just let the fox into the henhouse. The elevator door slid open, and the air changed instantly. The lobby upstairs smelled like money and pretension, but the basement smelled like damp cardboard and neglect. It was a vast, windowless room filled with rows of metal shelving that stretched back into the darkness. The fluorescent lights flickered with a low buzzing sound that set my teeth on edge. I stepped out, and the heavy steel door clicked shut behind me. I was alone. I stood there for a moment and just listened. I listened for the hum of a ventilation fan or the footsteps of a security guard, but there was nothing. It was the kind of silence that amplifies your own heartbeat. I walked down the central aisle, scanning the labels on the boxes. Gavin had told me this was where they kept the old records from the 90s, but I knew something he did not. I knew how lazy people were when it came to filing. When you have a secret, you do not want to keep it in your office where a secretary might stumble upon it. You bury it in the place where nobody ever goes. You bury it in the graveyard of old paperwork. I bypassed the sections labeled 1995 and 1998. I walked all the way to the back where the shelves were stacked with boxes marked miscellaneous and pending. My fingers trailed over the dust. I was looking for one specific project: the Legacy Trust Senior Housing Project. It was the last thing Robert had worked on before he got sick. It was supposed to be a 20-acre complex with affordable apartments and medical care for low-income seniors. I found the box on the bottom shelf pushed all the way to the wall. It was marked Project North Creek. I pulled it out, and the cardboard felt soft with humidity. I carried it to a small metal table under one of the flickering lights and opened the lid. My heart sank. A construction project of that size should have generated mountains of paperwork. There should have been thick rolls of blueprints and environmental impact studies and soil sample reports. There should have been invoices for concrete and steel and lumber. There should have been photos of the groundbreaking ceremony, but the box was light. It was terrifyingly light. I reached in and pulled out a single thin folder. Inside, there were no blueprints. There were no permits. There was just a stack of invoices stapled together on crisp white paper. I put on my glasses and began to read. Obsidian Solutions. There it was again. That name. The invoices were masterpieces of vague corporate language. $10,000 for strategic oversight. $15,000 for logistical consulting. $8,000 for feasibility analysis. I ran the numbers in my head as I flipped through the pages. In the last 18 months, this company had built the foundation for over $200,000. And yet, there was not a single receipt for a brick or a bag of cement. I looked closer at the dates. The payments were regular. They arrived like clockwork every 2 weeks. It wasn't a business expense. It was a salary. Someone was drawing a paycheck from the charity fund to do absolutely nothing. I dug deeper into the box, hoping to find a contract or a name associated with Obsidian Solutions. I found a photocopy of a service agreement at the very bottom. It was signed by Gavin Thorne on behalf of the foundation. The signature for Obsidian Solutions was an illegible scrawl, but then I saw the address. Usually vendors for a project like this would be located in the city or near the construction site, but the address for Obsidian Solutions was listed as Unit 4 at a strip mall in a town called East Haven. I knew East Haven. It was 40 minutes away, and it was not a place where high-end consulting firms set up shop. It was a place where you went to buy used tires or cash a lottery ticket. I felt a cold anger rising in my chest. It was a clean and sharp anger. Robert had spent his life building this money up penny by penny. He had shaken hands and hosted dinners and begged donors so that he could help people who had nothing. And now Gavin was siphoning it off into a shell company. He was not just stealing money. He was stealing the future of every senior citizen who was waiting for an apartment in North Creek. I took my phone out of my pocket. I knew I couldn't take the files. If Gavin realized they were missing, he would know I was on to him. He would destroy everything else. I laid the invoices out on the table and snapped pictures of them one by one. I made sure the text was clear. I photographed the service agreement. I photographed the address in East Haven. When I was done, I put everything back exactly as I had found it. I made sure the corners of the papers were aligned and the dust on the box lid was undisturbed. I dusted off my hands. I felt like a spy in a Cold War movie, but I was just a widow in a cardigan. I had the what, and I had the how. Now I needed the who. I needed to see what Obsidian Solutions actually was. I checked my watch. It was 2 o'clock. If I left now, I could make it to East Haven before rush hour. I walked back to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. I composed my face. I summoned the tears back to the corners of my eyes. I needed to walk past the receptionist one more time as the grieving widow. But inside my purse, the phone felt heavy with evidence. The game had started, and Gavin Thorne didn't even know he was playing. The drive to East Haven was a journey through the social strata of Connecticut. I started in the manicured silence of the financial district where the lawns were cut with laser precision and the cars hummed like electric razors. But as I merged onto the interstate and headed south, the scenery began to decompose. The green medians turned into gray concrete barriers, and the luxury sedans were replaced by pickup trucks with rusted wheel wells. My old car rattled as I hit a pothole. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I had not driven this far out of my neighborhood in years. Robert used to do all the driving. He liked to be the captain of the ship, and I was happy to be the navigator. Now I was charting a course into the unknown, and the map was leading me to a place that did not look like it held the answers to a $1,000,000 question. The GPS voice was calm and polite as she told me to exit the highway. I turned onto a road lined with fast food chains and pawn shops. The sky had turned a bruised purple color, threatening rain. It was the kind of afternoon that felt heavy. "Your destination is on the right," the GPS announced. I slowed down and pulled into the parking lot. I checked the address on the photo I had taken in the basement. 142 Elm Street, Unit 4. I looked up, expecting to see an office building. I expected maybe a small satellite office or at least a co-working space where consultants drank artisanal coffee. Instead, I was staring at a strip mall that had seen better decades. There was a laundromat on the left with a flickering neon sign that just said, "Wash." On the right was a store that sold discount liquor and lottery tickets. And sandwiched in the middle was a narrow storefront with a sign that read, "Pack and Ship Express." I turned off the engine. The silence in the car was sudden. I sat there for a moment, watching a plastic bag tumble across the asphalt in the wind. This was Obsidian Solutions, a high-priced consulting firm that billed the Callaway Foundation thousands of dollars a month, was located in a place where you could rent a mailbox for $20 a year. I felt a bubble of hysterical laughter rising in my throat. It was so brazen. It was so insultingly simple. Gavin didn't even try to make it look legitimate. He assumed nobody would ever check. He assumed the board members were too busy with their galas and the auditors were too lazy to drive to East Haven. And he was right about them, but he was wrong about me. I grabbed my purse and stepped out of the car. The air smelled of exhaust and fried grease from the burger joint down the road. I locked the car manually. I pulled my cardigan tight around my body, not because of the cold, but because I felt exposed. I walked into the Pack and Ship Express. A bell chimed above the door. The inside smelled of packing tape and stale cigarette smoke. Behind the counter sat a man who looked like he had become part of the furniture. He was reading a comic book and chewing gum with a slow bovine rhythm. He didn't even look up when I walked in. "Excuse me?" I said in my best confused grandmother voice. He turned a page. "Yeah, help you with something." I walked up to the counter and leaned on it slightly as if I needed the support. "I am looking for a business called Obsidian Solutions. My nephew works there, and he told me to meet him here for lunch, but I think I might be lost. Is their office in the back?" The clerk finally looked up. He looked at my pearls and my sensible shoes. He snorted. "Lady, there ain't no offices here. This is a mailbox rental." I feigned shock. "Oh dear. But the address says Unit 4. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder to a wall of brass boxes. "Unit 4 is just a box. Box number 4. Right there near the top." I looked where he pointed. It was a small metal door about 4 inches high. "So nobody works here?" I asked. "Nobody works here but me," he said. "Guy comes in once a week to pick up the mail. Tall guy. Flashy suit. Drives a black car. Just came in this morning, actually. Cleared it out." My heart hammered against my ribs. A tall guy in a flashy suit. Gavin. So he does not have a desk here, I pressed. The clerk laughed, and it was a dry, rasping sound. Lady, unless your nephew is a hamster, he don't work in box 4. Thank you, I said. You have been very helpful. I turned and walked out before my legs gave way. I made it to my car and collapsed into the driver's seat. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely put the key in the ignition. It was confirmed. Obsidian Solutions was a ghost. It was a vacuum cleaner attached to the foundation's bank account, sucking up money that was meant for the poor. And Gavin had been here this morning. He had cleared out the box. That meant there were checks or statements in there that he needed to hide. I looked at the rearview mirror. My face was pale, but my eyes were bright. I was terrified, yes, but I was also furious. I started the car and backed out of the spot. As I drove away from the depressing strip mall, I realized something important. Gavin was sloppy. He was arrogant, and arrogant men make mistakes when they get comfortable. But he wasn't comfortable anymore. I had stirred the water. And as I merged back onto the highway, the rain finally began to fall, washing the dust off my windshield, but doing nothing to clean the rot I had just uncovered. I made it home just as the storm broke in earnest. The rain lashed against the windows of the empty house like handfuls of gravel thrown by an angry ghost. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands. The adrenaline from the afternoon had faded and left behind a shaky exhaustion. I kept seeing that metal mailbox in my mind. Box 4. The coffin where he buried the truth. I was thinking about calling a lawyer, but I hesitated. Lawyers move slowly, and they leave paper trails. If I alerted the firm's legal counsel, Gavin would know within the hour. He controlled the flow of information like a dam controls a river. I needed more than just a suspicion before I blew the whistle. I needed undeniable proof. Then I saw the headlights. They swept across the kitchen wall like searchlights cutting through the gloom. A car had pulled into my driveway. I was not expecting anyone. My friends knew better than to visit after dark, and the delivery trucks had long since finished their rounds. I walked to the front window and peered through the blinds. A black Tesla was idling in the rain. It looked like a shark swimming in the dark water. Gavin. My heart gave a painful thump against my ribs. Had he seen me at the strip mall? Had the clerk called him? No, I told myself. Calm down, Martha. You are just a lonely widow. Play the part. I unlocked the front door just as he reached the porch. He was holding a large umbrella and a bottle of wine. He looked immaculate despite the storm. His suit was dry and his hair was perfect. Auntie Martha, he said with that bright plastic smile. I was in the neighborhood and I saw your lights on. I thought you might need some company on a night like this. I forced myself to smile back. I opened the door wide. Oh, Gavin, what a surprise, I said. Come in, come in. You will catch your death out there. He stepped inside, and the smell of him filled the hallway. It was expensive cologne mixed with the damp scent of rain. It was an invasive smell. He shook out his umbrella and handed me the wine. It was a vintage red that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I brought a little something to warm you up, he said. We went into the living room. I did not offer him a seat, but he took one anyway, claiming Robert's old leather armchair as if it were his birthright. He crossed his legs and looked around the room with a critical eye. You know, Martha, he said softly, I have been worried about you. I sat on the edge of the sofa clutching my cardigan. Worried why? He sighed and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You seemed so fragile today at the office. Confused even. Asking about those old files. Digging up the past. It is not healthy, Martha. Grief does strange things to the mind. I felt a flash of cold anger, but I tamped it down. I widened my eyes. I just miss him, Gavin, I said. I know, he said soothingly. I know, but the board is worried too. They are worried that the stress of your position as a voting member might be too much for you right now. We want to protect you. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope. He placed it on the coffee table between us. It looked heavy. What is this? I asked. It is just a formality, he said, waving a hand dismissively. A little update to the bylaws. It essentially says that you voluntarily step down from voting on financial matters. You keep your title, of course, and your pension. But you let the younger generation handle the heavy lifting. He paused, and the silence stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. We would hate for anything to happen to your monthly stipend, he added, especially with the cost of maintaining this big old house. If the board thought you were incompetent, they might freeze the assets pending a review. The threat was subtle, but it was there. It was wrapped in concern, but it was a dagger nonetheless. Sign this paper and shut up, or we will cut off your money. I looked at the envelope. I did not reach for it. You want me to sign away my vote? I asked, my voice trembling just enough. I want you to rest, Gavin corrected. I want you to be safe. I can't have you driving around to strange places or stressing yourself out over numbers you don't understand. So he did know. He didn't know exactly where I had been, but he knew I wasn't just sitting at home, knitting. I stood up slowly. I picked up the bottle of wine. Thank you for the gift, Gavin, I said, and thank you for the papers. I am feeling very tired tonight. My head is a bit foggy. Can I read them in the morning? He stood up too, looming over me. He studied my face, looking for a crack in the mask. He was trying to decide if I was a threat or just a nuisance. Of course, he said finally. Read them over. But I need them back by tomorrow afternoon. The auditors are coming soon, remember? We need to have our house in order. He walked to the door, and I followed him. He opened it, and the sound of the rain rushed in again, loud and chaotic. Good night, Auntie Martha, he said. Sleep well. I locked the door behind him and threw the deadbolt. I listened to his car back out of the driveway and fade into the distance. I walked back to the living room and picked up the envelope. I tore it open. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. It was a power of attorney transfer. If I signed this, Gavin would have total control over my shares and my voice. He would be able to sell the land and drain the trust, and I would be powerless to stop him. He thought he had cornered me. He thought the threat of poverty would make me obedient. I went to the kitchen and poured the expensive wine down the sink. The red liquid swirled away like blood. He had made a mistake. He had shown me his hand. He was scared. I was not going to sign his paper. I was going to use it as ammunition. I picked up the phone. I knew who I had to call. I couldn't do this alone anymore. I needed someone who could see inside the digital vaults that Gavin had built. I dialed a number I had not used in 10 years. Hello? Came a gravelly voice on the other end. Silas, I said. It is Martha Calloway. I have a job for you. I chose the meeting place carefully. The Rusty Spoon was a diner on the edge of the industrial district where the coffee tasted like battery acid and the jukebox was stuck on a permanent loop of 80s rock. It was loud. It was crowded with truck drivers and shift workers. It was the perfect place to talk if you did not want to be heard. I sat in a booth at the back with my back to the wall. I watched the door. Every time it opened, a gust of cold air and the smell of diesel exhaust rolled in. Then I saw him. Silas Blackwood looked exactly the same as he had 10 years ago, just with less hair and more wrinkles around his eyes. He was wearing a trench coat that had seen better days, and he carried a battered leather satchel that I knew contained a laptop worth more than the entire diner. Silas was an auditor from the old school. He did not trust the cloud. He did not trust Wi-Fi. He trusted hard drives and copper wires. He slid into the booth opposite me and signaled the waitress for coffee without saying a word. He looked at me with those sharp, bird-like eyes. "You look good, Martha," he said, his voice scratching like sandpaper. "You look like you are ready to kill someone." "I might be," I said. I slid a manila envelope across the sticky table. Inside were the printed photos of the invoices and the pictures of the mailbox in East Haven. Silas opened the envelope and shielded the contents with his body. He scanned the documents quickly. His eyebrows shot up. "Obsidian Solutions," he muttered. "Sloppy, very sloppy. Who is the architect of this disaster?" "Gavin Thorne," I said. Silas snorted. "The golden boy. I never liked him. He wears too much gel." I leaned in closer, lowering my voice below the thumping bass of the music. "He is trying to push me out, Silas. He tried to get me to sign away my voting rights last night. He threatened my pension. He is scared, which means he is vulnerable. But I need to know where the money is going. I know it goes into Obsidian, but where does it go after that?" Silas nodded. He pulled his laptop out of the bag. It was a thick black machine that looked like military hardware. He did not connect to the diner's Wi-Fi. Instead, he pulled out a small dongle and plugged it in, creating his own secure connection. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. He began to type. His fingers flew across the keys with a speed that defied his age. I watched him and sipped my terrible coffee. I felt a strange sense of comfort. This was familiar territory. The hunt, the puzzle, the slow unraveling of a lie. "I found the registration for Obsidian Solutions," Silas said without looking up. "It is registered in Delaware. Anonymous LLC. Classic move. But he made a mistake with the server payments." "What mistake?" I asked. "He paid for the website domain using a credit card linked to a holding company called GT Ventures," Silas said. "And GT Ventures is listed as a subsidiary of the Thorne Family Trust." He turned the laptop screen toward me. There it was. A spider web of lines connecting the fake consulting firm directly to Gavin's personal assets. "He is laundering it through 3 layers, Silas explained, pointing a calloused finger at the screen. "Foundation pays Obsidian. Obsidian pays GT Ventures for management fees. GT Ventures pays Gavin a dividend. It is a circle of theft." "How much?" I asked. Silas tapped a few more keys. "Based on the recurring payments and the duration?" "I would say he has siphoned off about $4 million in the last 2 years. I felt the breath leave my body. $4 million. That was enough to build the entire housing complex. That was enough to feed every senior in the county for a decade. And Gavin had stolen it to buy what? More suits, a bigger car, a vacation home in the Hamptons. It was not just greed. It was evil. "There is something else," Silas said, and his voice dropped even lower. I looked at him. "What?" "I am looking at the land registry," he said. "The land that the trust owns. The site for the North Creek project. There is a pending sale status on it." "A sale," I whispered. "But he can't sell it. It is charitable land. It is zoned for non-profit use. He has an application in to rezone it," Silas said. "Commercial luxury development. And the buyer is a consortium of developers from New York. If that sale goes through Martha, the land is gone. The housing project is dead, and the trust gets a fraction of the value while the rest disappears into consulting fees. When is the sale date? I asked. Silas looked at the screen. 2 days from now, the day of the gala. I sat back against the vinyl booth. The gala? Of course. He was going to announce the sale as a necessary tragedy. He was going to stand on stage and tell the donors that the foundation was broke and they had no choice but to sell the land to save the charity. He would look sad and noble, and everyone would believe him. And then he would pocket the millions. Can you get me these records? I asked. Can you print them out? The server payments, the link to GT Ventures, the sale application. Silas closed the laptop with a snap. I can do better than that. I can put everything on a thumb drive, encrypted. But Martha, you have to be careful. If he knows you have this, he will come for you. And not with legal papers this time. I am not afraid of Gavin Thorne, I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. I have faced down cartel accountants and mafia bookkeepers. Gavin is just a spoiled child playing dress-up. Silas smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. Go get him, Martha. He handed me a small silver drive. It was warm from the machine. I took it and dropped a $20 bill on the table for the coffee. I stood up. I had the weapon. Now I just needed the battlefield. 2 days, I said. I have 2 days to stop a $4 million heist. I walked out of the diner and into the cold, gray afternoon. The world looked different now. The buildings looked sharper. The noise of the traffic sounded like a war drum. I was not just fighting for a legacy anymore. I was fighting for justice. And Gavin Thorne was about to learn that he had messed with the wrong grandmother. The site for Project North Creek was located on the edge of town where the suburbs dissolved into wild scrub and old oak trees. I had seen the blueprints 100 times on Robert's desk. He had pointed to the empty spaces on the paper and described rose gardens and walking paths and a community center with big windows. He saw a sanctuary. I drove down the gravel road with the thumb drive burning a hole in my purse. The sky was still overcast, a bruising gray that matched my mood. I expected to find an empty lot. I expected to find overgrown weeds and maybe a rusted chain-link fence. But when I turned the final corner, I saw that the land was not empty at all. It was alive. There was no housing complex yet, but the community had not waited for permission to live there. The field was a patchwork of vegetable gardens. There were neat rows of tomatoes staked with old broom handles and mounds of squash vines spreading like green veins across the earth. In the center of the lot stood a collection of small temporary structures. A tool shed, a greenhouse made of plastic sheeting, a circle of mismatched lawn chairs where a group of elderly people sat drinking coffee from thermoses. I parked the car and stepped out. The air smelled of wet soil and basil. It was a smell of growth and hope. I walked toward the group. They looked up as I approached. They were people my age, people with gray hair and faces mapped with the lines of hard lives. They wore sturdy boots and worn jackets. One of them stood up. He was a tall man with a slight stoop, leaning on a cane. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked. His voice was wary. "I am just looking," I said. "My husband used to talk about this place. He wanted to build homes here." The man's face softened. "You must be Mrs. Calloway. I recognize you from the pictures in the paper." "I am Samuel." He extended a hand that felt like tree bark, rough and warm. "Robert was a good man," Samuel said. "He gave us permission to garden here while we waited for the funding. He said the land should be used, not hoarded." I looked around at the thriving garden. It was beautiful. It was exactly what Robert would have wanted. But then I saw it. Stapled to the wooden post of the tool shed was a piece of paper. It was bright orange. It screamed against the natural greens and browns of the garden. I walked over to it. The paper was damp from the rain, but the black block letters were still legible. Notice to vacate. This property is scheduled for immediate liquidation. All unauthorized occupants and personal property must be removed within 48 hours. By order of Thorne Management Group. 48 hours. I felt the blood drain from my face. Gavin wasn't just selling the land. He was clearing it out before the sale, so the developers wouldn't have to deal with the locals. He was treating these people like weeds to be pulled. Samuel came up beside me. He looked at the orange paper with a heavy resignation. "They put that up yesterday," he said quietly. "Just walked up and stapled it there while we were weeding. A young man in a suit. He didn't even look us in the eye." "What will you do?" I asked. Samuel shrugged, and the motion was full of defeat. "We will go. We have nowhere else to garden and nowhere else to gather, but we cannot fight a big company. They say the foundation is bankrupt. They say they have to sell to pay the debts. We understand business, Mrs. Calloway. We are just disappointed." Disappointed. It was such a gentle word for such a violent act. They were being robbed of their sanctuary, and they were apologizing for the inconvenience. I touched the orange paper. It felt cold and slick. "The foundation is not bankrupt, Samuel," I said, and my voice was hard. He looked at me surprised by the steel in my tone. "It is not bankrupt," I repeated louder. "It is being looted." I turned to look at him. "Listen to me, Samuel. Do not pack up. Do not move a single tomato plant. Do not take down that greenhouse." But the notice, he started. "Ignore the notice," I said. "I am going to the board meeting tomorrow. I am going to the gala, and I am going to fix this." I reached into my purse and pulled out my card. It had my home number on it. "If anyone comes back here, if anyone tries to touch this garden or lock this gate, you call me immediately. Do you understand?" Samuel took the card. He looked at it, and then he looked at me. A spark of hope lit up in his tired eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "We will stay put." I walked back to my car. My hands were no longer shaking. The fear I had felt yesterday was gone. The hesitation was gone. Gavin Thorne had made a mistake. He thought he was just moving numbers on a spreadsheet. He thought he was just liquidating an asset. He didn't realize that land is not just dirt. Land is people. I started the engine. The tires crunched on the gravel as I turned around. I had the evidence from the basement. I had the digital trail from Silas, and now I had the moral mandate. I was not just fighting for Robert's memory anymore. I was fighting for Samuel. I was fighting for the tomatoes. Tomorrow was the board meeting. Gavin expected a confused old widow to show up and sign his papers. He was in for a very rude awakening. The boardroom on the top floor was a place designed to make human beings feel small. The table was a slab of mahogany, long enough to land a plane on, and the windows offered a panoramic view of the city that made the people down on the street look like ants. I sat at the far end of the table opposite Gavin. I folded my hands on the polished wood and waited. The other board members filed in one by one. They were men and women of a certain tax bracket. They wore cashmere and heavy watches, and they smelled of expensive soap. They nodded to me with that tight-lipped pity that rich people reserve for the bereaved. They saw a widow who was out of her depth. They did not see the shark swimming in the shallows. Gavin stood at the head of the table. He looked commanding. He had a clicker in his hand and a PowerPoint presentation projected on the wall behind him. The first slide showed a steep red line plunging downward. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Gavin began, his voice grave and serious. As you know, the financial climate has been challenging. The foundation has suffered significant losses in our investment portfolio. We are bleeding capital. He clicked to the next slide. It showed a picture of the North Creek land. We have explored every avenue, Gavin continued. But the reality is that the senior housing project is no longer viable. The construction costs have skyrocketed. We simply do not have the liquidity to break ground. It is with a heavy heart that I must recommend we liquidate the asset. We have to sell the land to save the foundation. The board members murmured in agreement. They nodded solemnly. It was a good performance. It was clean and logical and completely false. I raised my hand. Gavin paused. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but he smoothed it over instantly. "Yes, Martha," he said with a patient smile. "Do you have a question?" I adjusted my glasses. I spoke slowly and softly, forcing them to lean in to hear me. "I am just a little confused, Gavin. You say we don't have the liquidity, but looking at the quarterly reports Robert used to bring home, we always kept a reserve fund for construction. $3 million. What happened to that?" Gavin sighed. He looked at the other board members as if to say, "Here we go." "Martha, accounting is complex," he said. "That money was absorbed by operational costs and consulting fees. We had to hire experts to navigate the zoning laws. It is all very technical." I nodded as if I accepted this. "I see," I said. "Experts, like Obsidian Solutions." The room went quiet. Gavin froze. The name hung in the air like a bad smell. He hadn't expected me to know the specific name. He thought I was just looking at totals. "Yes," he said, his voice tight. "They are a top-tier firm. But that is beside the point. The point is, the money is gone. We have to sell." I leaned forward. "But Gavin," I said, "you said you are recommending we sell. That implies we haven't found a buyer yet. That implies the land is still ours." "That is correct," he said. "We are currently seeking bids." Then why, I asked, keeping my voice sweet and innocent, why is there an eviction notice stapled to the shed at the garden? I drove out there yesterday. The notice says the land is already scheduled for liquidation to a specific developer. It says the deal is done. The board members shifted in their seats. They looked from me to Gavin. They didn't care about the garden, but they cared about being lied to. Gavin's face turned a mottled shade of red. He gripped the back of his leather chair. "That is just a formality," he snapped. "A standard legal precaution to clear the liability. You shouldn't be driving out there, Martha. It is not safe." "It didn't look dangerous," I said. "It looked like a garden. And the man I spoke to, Samuel, said the notice was put up by a man in a suit who refused to look him in the eye." "That is enough," Gavin barked. He slammed his hand down on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a pistol shot. The silence that followed was absolute. Gavin Thorne, the charming golden boy, had vanished. In his place was a cornered animal with bared teeth. "You do not understand how this works, Martha," he hissed, leaning over the table. "You are looking at things through a keyhole. This is high-level finance, not a grocery budget. We are selling the land because I say it is the only way to survive. I am the director. I make the hard choices while you sit at home and mourn." He stopped. He realized too late that he had gone too far. The board members were staring at him. They were not looking at him with admiration anymore. They were looking at him with distaste. He had just yelled at a 68-year-old widow in a room full of polite society. I looked at him calmly. I did not flinch. "I may not understand high finance, Gavin," I said softly. "But I know that you don't evict people before you have a buyer. Unless, of course, the buyer is already chosen, and the price is already fixed." I stood up. I gathered my purse. "I think I have heard enough for today," I said. "I will see you at the gala tomorrow, Gavin. I look forward to your speech." I walked out of the room. I felt their eyes on my back. I heard Gavin trying to sputter an apology, trying to reclaim the narrative, but the damage was done. I had cracked the mask. He was unstable. He was angry. And an angry man makes sloppy mistakes. I walked to the elevator with a spring in my step. I had him. I had him right where I wanted him. I waited until 2 in the morning before I went back. The city at that hour was a different creature entirely. The traffic had thinned to a trickle of yellow taxis, and the streetlights reflected on the wet pavement like spilled oil. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the foundation building. I did not want the security cameras to spot my license plate in the garage. I pulled my coat tight against the wind. I felt ridiculous and terrified all at once. I was a 68-year-old woman sneaking around in the dark like a cat burglar. My knees ached from the dampness, and my heart was fluttering in my chest like a trapped bird. But I had to do this. I knew Gavin. After the disaster at the board meeting, he would be in panic mode. He would be scrubbing the decks. I walked to the side entrance. The heavy steel door looked impenetrable, but I had the magic wand in my pocket. The key card Gavin had given me. He had given it to me so I could weep over old sentimental boxes in the basement. He never thought I would use it to invade his sanctuary. I pressed the plastic against the reader. The light blinked from red to green with a cheerful beep. I slipped inside. The building was silent. It was a heavy, pressurized silence that pressed against my eardrums. The security guard at the front desk was asleep, his head resting on his arms. I tiptoed past the station, my sneakers making no sound on the polished terrazzo floor. I took the service elevator to the top floor. As the numbers climbed higher, I felt the gravity of what I was doing. This was trespassing. This was theft. If I got caught, I would go to jail, and Gavin would win. He would paint me as a senile woman who had lost her mind. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor. It was dark except for the exit signs casting a green glow over the hallway. I walked toward Gavin's office. Then I heard it. It was a low mechanical grinding sound coming from down the hall. Whir, crunch, whir. The sound of a shredder. I pressed myself against the wall. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was in there. I crept closer, moving inch by inch, until I could see a sliver of light coming from under Gavin's door. I peered through the crack. Gavin was there. He had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie. His hair was messy, as if he had been running his hands through it. He looked frantic. He was grabbing handfuls of paper from a stack on his desk and feeding them into the machine. He was feeding them with a violence that made me shudder. I watched him destroy the history of the foundation. I watched him feed contracts and memos and ledgers into the teeth of the machine. He was erasing the past to protect his future. He grabbed a thick blue folder. I recognized it. It was the original deed to the North Creek land, the document that proved the land was held in a charitable trust forever. He shoved it into the slot. The machine groaned as it chewed through the thick paper. No! I screamed inside my head, but I bit my lip until I tasted blood. I could not burst in there. He was younger and stronger than me. If I startled him, he might do something desperate. I had to wait. I stood in the hallway for what felt like hours. My legs began to cramp. Finally, the noise stopped. Gavin grabbed his jacket and his briefcase. He looked around the room one last time, paranoid and sweaty. He turned off the light. I held my breath as he walked out of the office and headed toward the main elevators. I waited until I heard the ping of the elevator arrival and the doors sliding shut. Then I moved. I rushed into his office, The air smelled of ozone and hot motor oil. I went straight to the shredder. It was a massive industrial thing, sitting in the corner like a monolith. I pulled out the waste bin from the bottom. It was full, a mountain of confetti. Thousands of strips of paper cross-cut into meaningless gibberish. I sank to my knees on the expensive carpet. I turned on the flashlight from my phone and shined it into the bin. It looked hopeless. It was a blizzard of white noise. But then I saw it. The machine had jammed near the end. A clump of paper had gotten stuck in the blades and hadn't fallen all the way through. I reached up into the sharp metal teeth. I knew it was dangerous, but I didn't care. I worked the paper loose gently, pulling it free. It was a strip of the blue folder, and stuck to it was a fragment of a memo that had been inside. It wasn't much, just a few inches of paper, but it was enough. The date on the memo fragment was clear. It was dated 2 years ago. 2 years before the financial crisis that Gavin claimed had forced the sale, and below the date were 3 words in Gavin's distinctive handwriting. Target liquidation date. He had planned this. He had planned the bankruptcy 2 years ago when the foundation was still healthy. It wasn't a misfortune. It was a murder. He had killed the finances on purpose to get to the land. I shoved the paper fragments into my pocket. My hands were trembling violently now. I stood up and looked around the office. I wanted to burn it down. I wanted to smash his glass desk. But I did not. I was Martha Calloway. I was a professional. I had the smoking gun. It wasn't a whole gun, but it was a bullet casing, and that was all I needed. I slipped out of the office and back into the shadows. The hallway seemed longer now, and the green exit signs looked like eyes watching me. I made it to the elevator. I made it to the street. I made it to my car. I sat in the driver's seat and locked the doors. I pulled the scrap of paper out of my pocket and kissed it. Tomorrow was the gala. Tomorrow, Gavin would stand on a stage in a tuxedo and tell the world how sad he was. And I would be there to show them exactly what kind of monster hides behind a shredder. The morning of the gala arrived with a deceptively bright sun. The sky was a hard, scrubbed blue that hurt my eyes after a sleepless night. I sat at my kitchen table with the scrap of shredded paper sitting on a saucer like a holy relic. I had taped the fragments together. The handwriting was jagged where the blades had cut it, but the date was undeniable. I needed to be ready. The gala was at 7 o'clock at the Grand Hotel downtown. It was a black tie affair where the champagne flowed freely and the wallets opened wide. I had my dress laid out on the bed. It was a navy blue silk number that Robert had bought me for our 40th anniversary. It was elegant and armored. I decided to run a few errands before the evening. I needed gas for the car, and I wanted to get my hair done. I wanted to look impeccable when I destroyed Gavin Thorne. I wanted to look like a queen, not a victim. I drove to the gas station on the corner. I slid my debit card into the reader and selected regular. The machine beeped. A harsh electronic rejection. Authorization declined. See cashier. I frowned. That was odd. There was plenty of money in that account. Robert's life insurance payout had just cleared last month. I tried again. Beep. Declined. A line was forming behind me. A man in a pickup truck honked his horn. I felt a flush of embarrassment heat my neck. I canceled the transaction and dug through my purse for a credit card. I tried my Visa. Beep. Declined. My hands started to sweat. This was not a glitch. This was a blockade. I got back in the car and ignored the angry gestures of the driver behind me. I pulled into a parking spot and dialed the bank. My fingers fumbled with the phone. The hold music played a cheerful little tune that made me want to scream. Finally, a customer service representative answered. Her name was Brenda, and she sounded very young. "I am sorry, Mrs. Calloway," she said after I gave her my security answers. "But there is a hold on all your accounts. It is a fraud protection freeze." "Fraud?" I asked, my voice rising. "I have not committed any fraud. It is my money." "I understand," Ma'am Brenda said calmly. "But we received a notification from the executor of the estate and your financial proxy, Mr. Gavin Thorne. He flagged some highly irregular activity. There were large cash withdrawals and payments to unverified entities. He filed an affidavit of concern regarding your mental capacity to handle these funds." The world tilted on its axis. He had done it. He had used my own investigation against me. The payment to Silas, the cash I used at the diner. He had painted it as the erratic spending of a senile old woman falling for scams. "He locked it all, Brenda?" I asked. Checking savings and the investment portfolio, she confirmed. "Until the court reviews the affidavit on Monday morning, you have no access to electronic funds. It is for your own protection, Mrs. Calloway." I hung up the phone. I sat in the hot car and stared at the gas gauge. It was hovering near empty. For my own protection. It was a brilliant move. Gavin knew I was coming for him. He didn't know exactly what I had, but he knew I was dangerous. So he did the one thing that stops everything in America. He cut off the money. Without money, I couldn't buy gas. I couldn't pay for parking at the hotel. I couldn't even buy a sandwich. He wanted me stranded. He wanted me to be the crazy old lady screaming about conspiracies while he charmed the donors and sold the land. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked scared. I looked old. But then I remembered something. Gavin was a man of the digital age. He lived in a world of wire transfers and credit scores and invisible currency. He thought that if he turned off the computer, he turned off my life. But I was from a different generation. I was from a generation that didn't trust banks. I was from a generation that remembered hard times. I started the car and prayed I had enough fumes to get back home. When I pulled into the driveway, the needle was resting on the E. I ran inside the house. I didn't go to the computer. I went to the pantry. On the top shelf behind the dusty bags of flour and the cans of pumpkin puree sat an old ceramic jar shaped like a hen. It was ugly. Robert used to joke that it was the ugliest thing in the house. I reached up and pulled it down. It was heavy. I popped the ceramic head off the hen. Inside, there were rolls of bills. 20s, 50s, hundreds. For 40 years, whenever I had a little extra cash from a garage sale or a refund or a birthday gift, I put it in the hen. It was my rainy day fund, my runaway money, my freedom fund. I dumped it out on the kitchen table. It was a beautiful pile of green paper. It smelled like dust and security. I counted it quickly. $3,000. It wasn't millions. It wasn't enough to buy the land back. But it was enough to buy a tank of gas. It was enough to bribe a valet. It was enough to get me into that ballroom. Gavin thought he had frozen me out. He thought he had cut my strings. But he forgot that some of us don't need strings to move. I stuffed the cash into my purse. I went upstairs and put on the blue silk dress. I pinned my husband's military medal to the inside of my shawl, where nobody could see it, but where I could feel the cold metal against my heart. I was broke on paper. I was legally incompetent according to the bank. But I was rich in cash, and I was absolutely furious. I looked at the clock. It was 5:30. "Get ready, Gavin," I whispered to the empty room. "Auntie Martha is coming to the party." The Grand Hotel was a fortress of light. Searchlights swept the sky, and a red carpet bled down the front steps like an open wound. Limousines idled in a long, purring line, depositing women in glittering gowns and men who owned half the city. I parked my old sedan 3 blocks away in a public lot next to a dumpster. It was a humble start to the evening, but I did not mind. Joan of Arc probably didn't ride a thoroughbred into every battle. I walked the 3 blocks in my heels. The wind was biting, but the silk of my dress felt like armor. I clutched my purse tight against my side. Inside was the cash, the thumb drive, and the taped-together scrap of paper that would end Gavin Thorne's career. I reached the velvet rope at the entrance. A young man with a clipboard and an earpiece stood guard. He looked like a Secret Service agent who had been demoted to party planning. "Name, please," he droned without looking up. "Martha Calloway," I said loud and clear. He ran his finger down the list. He stopped. He frowned. He tapped his earpiece. "I am sorry, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Your name has been flagged. I have strict instructions from Mr. Thorne that you are not to be admitted. He said something about health concerns." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Gavin had put a bouncer on his own aunt. He really was thorough. I stepped closer to the young man. I could smell his peppermint breath mints. "Young man," I said, my voice low and dangerous, "do you know who I am?" "My husband founded this charity. My name is on the brass plaque in the lobby." "I understand, ma'am," he said, looking uncomfortable. But Mr. Thorne was very specific. He said, "You might be confused." I reached into my purse. I didn't pull out a tissue. I pulled out a roll of $100 bills. It was $500 wrapped in a rubber band. I pressed it into his hand beneath the clipboard. "I am not confused," I whispered. "I am just a widow who wants to hear the speech about her late husband, and you are a young man who probably makes minimum wage and has student loans." He looked at the money. He looked at me. He looked at the door. He was not a bad kid. He was just part of the machinery. And machinery needs grease. He stepped aside and unhooked the velvet rope. "Go on in, ma'am," he muttered. "I didn't see you." I walked past him and into the lobby. The sound of a string quartet washed over me. The air smelled of expensive perfume and roasted duck. I moved through the crowd like a ghost. I saw faces I knew. People who had come to my house for Christmas parties. People who had sent flowers. They nodded to me vaguely, but their eyes slid away. I was the old news. Gavin was the new star. I made my way to the ballroom doors. They were open, and the room was a sea of round tables and candlelight. Gavin was already on stage. He looked magnificent in his tuxedo. He stood behind the podium bathed in a spotlight that made his hair shine like a halo. He was leaning forward, speaking into the microphone with a tone of practiced sorrow. "And so," he said, his voice echoing through the vast room, "it is with a heavy heart that we face this reality. The financial headwinds have been too strong. The North Creek project that my mentor Robert dreamed of, it is simply not sustainable." A murmur of sympathy went through the crowd. I stood at the back of the room in the shadows. I scanned the front tables. There they were, the consortium. 3 men in gray suits sitting at the VIP table right in front of the stage. They didn't look sad. They looked hungry. They were the developers who were going to turn the community garden into a strip mall. Gavin continued. "However, we have found a solution, a way to save the foundation itself. We have accepted a bid to sell the land. It is a painful choice, but it is the responsible choice." He paused for dramatic effect. He wiped a fake tear from his eye. "Tonight, we sign the papers. Tonight, we secure the future." The crowd began to applaud. It was a polite, oblivious applause. They were clapping for the destruction of a dream because they had been told it was a rescue. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. The time for sneaking was over. The time for polite questions was over. I started walking. I walked down the center aisle. My heels clicked on the parquet floor. Click, click, click. The applause began to die down as people noticed me. Heads turned. Whispers started. Is that Martha? What is she doing here? I thought she was sick. I kept walking. I did not look left or right. I looked straight at Gavin. He saw me. His smile faltered. His eyes went wide. He gripped the podium. For a second, he looked like he might shout for security, but he couldn't. Not in front of the donors. Not in front of the press. He had to play the loving nephew. Auntie Martha, he stammered into the microphone, and the feedback whined. What a surprise. We didn't think you were well enough to join us. I reached the stairs to the stage. I was 68 years old, and my knees hurt, but I climbed those stairs like I was ascending a throne. I walked across the stage. I stood next to him. I was a head shorter than him, but in that moment, I felt 10 feet tall. I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. He was too stunned to stop me. I turned to the crowd. The lights were blinding, but I didn't blink. I am feeling much better. Thank you, Gavin, I said. My voice was steady. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 40 years catching liars. I looked out at the sea of faces. My nephew tells you that the foundation is broke, I said. He tells you that we have to sell the land to survive. He tells you that this is a tragedy. I reached into my purse. I pulled out the thumb drive and the taped-up memo. I held them up. But I am a forensic accountant, and I have brought my own numbers. Gavin lunged for me. Martha, don't he? Hissed. I sidestepped him. Tonight, I said loudly, we are going to do an audit, right here, right now. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 300 people in tuxedos and jewels held their breath as I stood on that stage. The microphone felt heavy in my hand, but my grip was iron. Beside me, Gavin was vibrating with panic. He looked at the sound technician in the back of the room and made a slashing motion across his throat, signaling him to cut the feed. But the sound technician was a young man with purple hair and a nose ring, and I had seen him rolling his eyes during Gavin's speech. He did not cut the feed. He crossed his arms and waited. Martha, please, Gavin, hissed his voice, trembling with forced laughter. This is embarrassing. You are having an episode. Let's get you some water. He reached for my arm. I pulled away sharply. Do not touch me, Gavin, I said into the microphone, and my voice boomed across the room. I turned to the audience. I locked eyes with the 3 developers at the front table. This man tells you the foundation is bankrupt, I said, my voice calm and clinical. He tells you the money has vanished into the ether of economic downturn. But money does not vanish. Physics tells us that matter cannot be created or destroyed. Accounting tells us the same thing about cash. It just moves. I held up the thumb drive, and in this case, it moved into a shell company called Obsidian Solutions. Gavin's face drained of color. He looked like a man who had been shot. Obsidian Solutions is not a consulting firm, I continued. It is a mailbox in a strip mall in East Haven next to a liquor store. I went there. I took pictures. And for the last 2 years, this foundation has paid that mailbox $4 million in consulting fees. A gasp rippled through the room. The developers at the front table exchanged nervous glances. They started to gather their folios. That is a lie, Gavin shouted. He abandoned the microphone and screamed it. She is senile. She doesn't know what she is talking about. I ignored him. I pulled the taped-together scrap of paper from my pocket.
And he tells you that selling the North Creek land is a desperate last resort, I said. He tells you he is heartbroken. But I have here a memo from his own office. It was in his shredder last night. I held the jagged paper up to the light. It is dated 2 years ago, I read. It is titled, Target Liquidation Date. He didn't sell the land because we were broke. He broke the foundation so he could sell the land. He planned this. He starved the charity to feed his own greed. I turned to face Gavin. He was not the golden boy anymore. He was small and sweaty and ruinously exposed. You underestimated me, Gavin, I said softly, but the microphone caught every syllable. You thought I was just a widow. You thought I was just a prop for your sympathy vote. But you forgot what I used to do for a living. I catch thieves. And you are a thief. Gavin looked at the crowd. He looked for an ally. He looked for someone to save him. But the faces staring back were cold. The wealthy do not like to be swindled, and they certainly do not like to be embarrassed. The doors at the back of the room opened. I had sent a text to Silas before I walked on stage. 2 police officers walked in. They did not look like they were there for the hors d'oeuvres. Gavin saw them. His shoulders slumped. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon. I turned back to the microphone. There will be no sale tonight, I announced. The North Creek land belongs to the people. It belongs to the gardeners and the seniors and the dreamers. And as long as I am breathing, not 1 inch of it will be paved. The room erupted. It wasn't polite applause this time. It was a roar. It was the sound of truth breaking through a wall of lies. I walked down the stairs. I didn't look back as the officers approached the stage. I didn't need to see the handcuffs. I had already closed the file. I walked out of the ballroom and into the cool night air. My feet hurt, and I was exhausted, but I felt lighter than air. 6 months later, the first foundation was poured at North Creek. We didn't use luxury developers. We used local crews. Samuel, the head gardener, cut the ribbon. The tomatoes were ripe, and the sun was shining. I am the chairwoman of the board now. I go into the office every day. I check every invoice. I check every receipt. And on my desk, right next to the picture of Robert, sits a little ceramic hen. It is empty now, but it reminds me that you don't need millions to start a revolution. You just need a little courage and a keen eye for the margins. So, that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. When family betrays you, do you stay silent to protect the name, or do you burn it down to save the truth? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.